There was a dull, heavy thud against my wall. Startled, my eyes instinctively darted to the old, intricately patterned rug hanging over my bed. The shouting next door, which had been escalating for hours, had finally reached a fever pitch. Minutes ago, I could at least make out a few words. Now, it had degenerated into a single, continuous, piercing shriek. My heart hammered against my ribs in sheer panic. The non-stop screaming matches from the apartment across the hall had become a grim routine, but I still couldn't get used to how violent they were. I had only been living in this run-down 8-story building for 2 months. I'd been forced to move out of my family home. I just couldn't stand living under the same roof as my dad's new trophy wife, who was barely 5 years older than me. To his credit, my father bought me this tiny studio apartment for my 18th birthday, claiming he didn't want his daughter rotting away in some sketchy college dorm. But honestly, a dorm might have been safer. At first, I loved the place. There was a supermarket on the ground floor, and the university was just a short walk away. Nearby, there was a scenic artificial lake and a park where I'd take quiet walks in the evening. I remember being shocked that an apartment in such a nice area was selling so cheap. A week later, I found out why. It was all because of apartment 38. Not just our hallway, but the entire building, and the whole neighborhood for that matter, know the tenants of that god-forsaken apartment by sight. It was home to the Banco couple. The wife, Lyudmila, or just Lucy, was a heavy-set woman of unrecognizable age. She was bloated, with permanent dark bruises under her eyes and sallow yellowish skin. It seemed her entire wardrobe consisted of a single faded floral bathrobe with a massive patch sewn over the stomach. Her dull blonde hair was a permanent, chaotic bird's nest that had clearly never seen a comb or basic soap. Her voice was low and raspy. If you heard her speak without looking, you'd easily mistake her for a very old man. Her husband, Vasily, was the polar opposition. Tall, gaunt, and skeletal, with bags under his eyes so deep they looked hollow. A swollen, bulbous nose hung over his upper lip, while his lower lip permanently sagged open. Tufts of colorless hair sprouted haphazardly behind his protruding ears. Unlike his wife, Vasya occasionally changed his salt-stained tank top for a couple of other equally dirty t-shirts. The first time I met Lyudmila, I actually found her collapsed outside the building entrance. Her bathrobe was hitched up, and her knees were covered in fresh scrapes, likely from a hard fall. But she didn't care at all. Flailing on the dusty asphalt like an overturned turtle, she was incoherently muttering nonsense. "Ma'am, are you okay?" I rushed over, setting my grocery bag on the ground. I shot a judgmental look at a neighbor from the 3rd floor who was unloading bags from her car trunk. "Don't waste your time with her," the neighbor said loudly, slamming her trunk shut. "They're the local junkies. Her husband will be out in a minute to deal with her." Sure enough, a moment later, Vasya staggered around the corner of the building, leaning one hand against the brick wall for support. In his other hand, he clutched a crumpled black plastic bag that rattled with glass bottles. His head jerked with a slight tremor, his legs planted wide apart to keep his balance.
"Lucy!" he roared, a strained, gravelly screech. "Lucy, what the hell are you doing down there?" "Vasya," his wife groaned, raising her trembling arms. "Help me, sweetheart, I fell." "Good Lord, when will you two finally drink yourselves to death?" the neighbor muttered, spitting on the ground before opening the heavy lobby door. I slipped inside right behind her, desperate to escape the pathetic scene. After that, I saw them passed out in the courtyard countless times. Once, as I was leaving my apartment, I accidentally struck Vasya in the head with my door. He had curled up sound asleep in the shared hallway, leaving a massive puddle of urine beneath himself. Sometimes I'd stumble upon their guests in the stairwell, who were just as vile as the hosts of apartment 38. Not only did they reek horribly, but they would randomly scream profanities and even use the stairs as a restroom. It became terrifying to leave the apartment, especially for the kids and the elderly tenants. I honestly can't recall a single day I saw the Bankos sober. In the morning, they would scream at each other, frequently coming to blows, only to passionately make up by evening. This lovely couple reminded me of a troll and a goblin, poisoning the life of the entire building. And the worst part, there was absolutely no stopping them. The police stopped responding to the neighbors' complaints long ago. The local officer just shrugged it off, claiming it wasn't his problem. They aren't violent, they just pass out wherever they get drunk. But what exactly did he mean by not violent? The neighbors told me a few deeply unsettling stories. For instance, Lucy once took over the entire playground, screaming at mothers and their children, eventually throwing rocks to chase them away. Vasya once snatched a cane right out of an old man's hands and beat him across the back with it. Astoundingly, nothing happened to them even then. I personally watched from my window as the perpetually wasted couple violently ambushed a food delivery courier for absolutely no reason. But the most horrifying discovery was near the trash chute on the second floor. I stumbled upon the body of a stray cat. The poor thing had been brutally mutilated, and a smeared trail of blood led directly to the door of apartment 38. When confronted about killing the animal, both Bankos simply laughed. They even threatened to hunt down the rest of the stray cats the neighborhood grandmothers fed and butcher them all. I eventually decided to post their story online, exposing the police negligence and trying to spark public outrage. The post got a lot of traction, and some comments even urged me to reach out to a national investigative TV show. I was seriously considering it, and some of my neighbors were fully on board. But unfortunately, I ran out of time. A few days ago, I was walking home from classes, riding a high because my professor had given me top marks for my presentation on ancient cuneiform script. The weather was warm and beautiful. I was thinking about taking a walk around the lake with my best friend. As I approached the building entrance, I slowed my pace, digging in my bag for my keys. Because of a parked car, I couldn't see the bench where the neighborhood grandmothers usually gathered to gossip. But that day, they weren't there. Rounding the car, I froze, my bag still clutched in my hand. The Banko couple had completely taken over the bench. Next to a tilted trash can stood an almost empty bottle of vodka. They were already completely wasted. Looking at them made a cold wave of pure revulsion wash over me. They were pressed tightly against each other. Lucy's bathrobe was wide open, and they were kissing passionately, making disgusting, sloppy noises. Breaking away from her husband, Lucy gasped heavily for air. "Do you remember?" Vasya rasped, burying his swollen nose in her cheek. "Back in the village, by the fence?" "Oh, I remember, Vasya," the woman groaned hoarsely. Nausea welled up in my throat, breaking me out of my trance. Grabbing my keys so tightly they dug into my palm, I practically bolted toward the entrance. Trying hard not to look at them, I tapped my key fob against the intercom lock and slipped into the dim safety of the building. I let out a long breath, realizing I had been holding it in pure disgust. Right out in the open, barely 30 feet from a playground. But there was no point in confronting them. Their brains had been fried by alcohol years ago. Slinging my bag over my shoulder, I headed for the stairs. I rarely used the elevator since I lived on the second floor. But the moment I reached the first landing, I heard the intercom buzz downstairs. The stairwell brightened for a second as the front door swung open. I turned around to see which neighbor was coming in, thinking I should say hello. In that brief flash of daylight framing the doorway, a tall, hunched silhouette appeared. It had long, skeletal arms, flailing them wildly as it sprinted. The figure closed the distance between us with terrifying speed. I only had time to gasp in shock. Fingers reeking of stale grease clamped like a vice onto my hair, and with brutal force slammed my head directly into the concrete wall. It felt as though my skull had cracked wide open. A deafening ringing exploded in my ears, accompanied by a blinding flash of pain. A heavy boot slammed into my ribs, instantly driving all the air from my lungs. I collapsed back onto the floor, curling into a ball, desperately trying to catch a ragged breath. Several more heavy kicks rained down on my torso and head. Then I was violently yanked up by my matted hair. A foul, putrid breath brushed against my tear-soaked cheek. The next thing I knew, I was tumbling backward down the concrete stairs. My knees violently struck several steps before I hit my shoulder hard, somehow managing to curl inward as I fell. Terrified, my heart was throat-bound. The right side of my head felt like it was splitting apart, and hot tears blurred my vision. Dragging myself onto my hands and knees, sobbing and gasping for air, I crawled toward the exit, trying to scream for help. "If you ever say another word about me or my wife, you little bitch," Vasya hissed, his lips brushing against my ear. "If I see one more line on the internet, I will rip your throat out." He snarled a barrage of horrific threats, detailing exactly what he would do to me if I didn't delete every single post about his family. My mind was spinning, but the message was crystal clear. He was explicitly threatening to murder me. I nodded frantically, whimpering that I would delete everything right away. With a final insult, he spat directly into my face and walked back out into the courtyard. I sat on that filthy floor for a long time, hyperventilating in sheer hysterics. My entire body was a map of throbbing pain, but my head was the worst. I carefully checked it with my fingers, making sure I wasn't bleeding out. Somehow, I dragged myself up to my apartment, fumbled with the keys, and collapsed onto the couch without even taking off my shoes. It was the worst day of my life. Despite the agonizing headache and a sharp burning sensation in my chest, I didn't go to the hospital. I was pathologically terrified to even peek out the door, especially since I could still hear the raspy, muffled voices of the Benkos outside my window, as if they were waiting for me to step out. For 2 days, I stayed holed up inside, living on a cocktail of painkillers. I could have called an ambulance, but I was terrified those psycho neighbors would attack the medics and me. I just prayed the pain would fade. When I woke up this morning, I couldn't tell if I was feeling better or worse. My head was throbbing with a dull, heavy ache, concentrated right where it had struck the wall. I could barely move around the apartment, shuffling along while gripping the walls, unable to straighten my back because of a sharp stabbing pain in my side. I just hoped it was a severe bruise and not a fractured rib. After swallowing a handful of pills, I laid back on the couch with my phone. As I was texting the leader of my university study group, a sudden, blood-curdling shriek pierced the wall, making me nearly drop my phone. The screaming instantly triggered my headache again, and my heart began to race in terror. The violent argument next door went on for nearly an hour, occasionally dropping into an eerie silence before erupting into high-pitched screeches all over again. How much more of this could anyone take? My empty stomach rumbled painfully. I needed to get up and make something to eat, especially since some of my medication couldn't be taken on an empty stomach. Clutching my side with my right arm and biting my lip to stifle a groan, I slowly swung my legs over the edge of the couch. Gripping the armrest, I forced myself up, barely suppressing a cry as a sharp spike of pain flared beneath my chest. The world went black for a split second. To the rhythm of muffled thuds against the wall and what sounded like an animalistic squealing, I limped into the kitchen. I really should have bought earplugs. Opening the fridge, my face fell. I hadn't been to the store in just 2 days, but it was completely bare. A carton of milk, a bottle of kefir, a couple of jars of homemade preserves from a friend, and a spoiled salad. That wasn't going to cut it. Fine, I had to risk it. I decided to order food delivery, praying that Banco wouldn't ambush the driver. There was no way I could walk to the store myself, and my face looked horrific anyway, pale, with massive dark circles under my eyes. I looked exactly like a panda. I was too ashamed to let anyone see me. While waiting for the delivery, I was relieved to hear the screaming next door finally stop. The courtyard was quiet, too. The bench was occupied by the usual neighborhood grandmothers. I figured the monsters in apartment 38 had finally made up and passed out in a drunken stupor. That meant it would be peaceful, at least until evening. 20 minutes later, the intercom sang to life. I picked it up instantly, since I was already pacing around the hallway. I unlocked the deadbolt, pushed my front door open, and froze in sheer shock. The old wooden door to the Banco apartment was wide open. Inside their place and throughout the shared hallway hung a thick, suffocating silence. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic rattling of the elevator shaft somewhere above. Why was their door wide open? Did one of them run away, or did something happen? Curiosity overrode my terror. I took a cautious step forward, crossing the threshold of my own doorway. Letting go of the handle, I leaned slightly into the hall, straining my neck to look inside. The first thing that caught my eye instantly sent a violent shiver down my spine. There was a smeared, bloody handprint on their door, heavy red splatters across the faded wallpaper in their hallway, and a massive, pooling puddle on the dirty linoleum. Blood. It was unmistakable. I knew the Bancos fought constantly, breaking each other's noses, biting, scratching. But this was different. There was way too much blood. I began to tremble violently, my head throbbing anew. Yet I took 2 more agonizing steps until I was directly aligned with the entrance of that horrific apartment. The trail from the bloody pool smeared all the way into the kitchen. From where I stood, I could see the kitchen table cluttered with bottles and plates of half-eaten food, a curtainless window with a jagged crack running through the glass, a knocked-over stool, and shattered dishes littering the floor. And right next to the fallen stool, I saw Lucy's bare feet and the hem of her floral bathrobe. Her heels were completely coated in blood. It looked as though she had been dragged all the way from the front door to the kitchen. No matter how much I despised Lucy, she was a human being. She needed help. Clutching the zipper of my sweater with trembling fingers, I opened my mouth to call out her name in a whisper. But I froze mid-breath. What if Vasya was still inside? If he was, he would turn on me next. As if reading my thoughts, Vasily stepped into view. He walked out from behind the kitchen wall, stepping right over his wife as if she were nothing more than a fallen log, and stopped dead in the doorway. The light from the kitchen window was at his back, casting his face in deep shadow. But his eyes seemed to gleam with a manic, unnatural light in the gloom. In the absolute silence, I could hear his heavy, rattling breath, like a dying horse. The white tank top stretched across his chest was completely soaked in a deep, glistening crimson. In his right hand, he gripped the long wooden handle of a hatchet, and in his left, gasping, I slammed my hand over my mouth. He was holding his wife's head tightly by her matted hair. A primal, screaming panic flooded my brain. Run! Get out of here! Lock yourself in your apartment! Bolt every single lock! But my boots felt like they were cemented to the floor. My legs were entirely numb. I stood there, panting, tears streaming down my face, screaming at myself inside my head. Run, you idiot! Run! But I couldn't move a muscle. Lunging across my threshold, I slammed into my door, grabbing the handle with both hands to pull it shut. In that exact microsecond, a sharp, agonizing slice tore through my left shoulder blade. I screamed, my legs giving out instantly as I dropped to my knees. A warm sensation immediately began pouring down my back, soaking my sweater and causing it to plaster against my skin. Without letting go of the handle, I looked back and saw Vasily towering over me. His eyes were wide, completely consumed by a rabid, manic frenzy. and white foam was bubbling at the corners of his twisted mouth. He had raised the hatchet high above his head, preparing to bring it down on me. People always say your entire life flashes before your eyes when you're about to die. But all I could think about was my dad. How absolutely devastated he would be when he found out.
Suddenly, a massive, bright green square object crashed into Vasya with incredible force. Losing his footing, my neighbor stumbled sideways, slamming hard against a vertical water pipe. A bulky, heavy delivery backpack thudded onto the floor between us. A young guy wearing a matching bright delivery jacket grabbed me under my arms and effortlessly dragged me backward into my apartment. Vasily let out an animalistic, bear-like roar and lunged at us. The delivery guy slammed the door shut right in his face, throwing his entire body weight against the wood. The psycho outside screamed even louder. His right arm managed to thrust through the narrow gap before the door clicked shut. His gnarled fingers clawed wildly at the air, ripping the canvas of the delivery guy's jacket before sliding upward. His hand found the guy's bare neck and clamped down on his throat in a death grip. The courier choked, gasping for air, and the door groaned under the pressure as the gap began to widen again. A second more, and the killer would be inside. Pushing myself up against the shoe rack, gritting my teeth against the blinding pain in my back, I managed to stand. With no options left, I lunged forward and bit down with everything I had into my neighbor's thick, leathery arm. Banco let out a deafening, piercing shriek that made my ears ring. He thrashed violently, slamming against the outside of the door, but I refused to let go, sinking my teeth deeper into his flesh. Finally, with a desperate, violent jerk, he ripped his arm out of the gap. The courier instantly slammed the door completely shut, throwing the deadbolt into place. We both stumbled backward, gasping. Outside, Banco was screaming incoherent rage, hacking at the thick wooden door with his hatchet, kicking it so hard the frame shuddered on its hinges. A wave of intense nausea hit me from the copper taste of blood in my mouth and the absolute nightmare of the situation. My face was drenched in a mix of tears and cold sweat. "Are you okay?" the delivery guy panted, turning to me. "How bad did he get you?" I could barely process his face, even though he was standing right next to me. His features were just a blur in my spinning mind. "I don't know," I whispered, sliding down against the bathroom door. My left shoulder felt like it was on fire. Everything felt completely surreal, as if I had just fallen asleep on my couch and was trapped in a horrific nightmare. I wanted so badly to wake up. Through another minute of throwing himself against my door, Banco finally gave up. We heard him letting out enraged, guttural growls as he stomped toward the stairwell, scraping the blade of his hatchet against the concrete walls. Was he going outside? But there were people out there. Damn it, the courier cursed, frantically pacing the hallway with his phone out. I'm calling the police, but the line is completely dead or busy. We have to help, I choked out, my tongue heavy and unresponsive. We have to warn them. Leaning heavily against the wall, I dragged myself into the kitchen toward the window. The room was tilting violently, like I was standing on the deck of a ship in the middle of a storm. My legs were numb, refusing to cooperate. The delivery guy was shouting something after me,
but I couldn't make out a single word through the loud, piercing ringing in my ears. I stumbled into a small table, grabbing the edge to keep from collapsing, took 2 more agonizing steps, and slammed my shoulder into the fridge. Inside, glass jars rattled, and a couple of magnets clattered to the floor. Finally, I reached the window and gripped the sill with a white knuckle hold. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear the darkness creeping into my vision. Reaching out a trembling hand, I turned the plastic latch and pushed the window open. I needed to draw in a deep breath and scream at the people below to run and hide. Gripping the cool plastic, I looked down into the courtyard. On this warm, sunny afternoon, the playground and the benches were completely deserted. Instead, about a dozen children of various ages were sprinting in terror across the grass, screaming at the top of their lungs. Were they playing a game? No. Crawling on her hands and knees past the sandbox was a young girl. Walking slowly right behind her was Vasily. Catching up to her, he delivered a brutal kick to her ribs, flattening her against the dirt. He stomped his heavy boot onto her back, pinning her to the ground, and raised the hatchet high above his head. A swift, violent downward swing. Through the haze of my tears, I saw the blade connect. I felt like I could actually hear the horrific, sickening crunch from all the way up here. A wave of bitter bile rushed up my throat. My legs gave out completely, and I collapsed to my knees, my fingers slipping uselessly off the smooth windowsill. Before I hit the floor, the courier's arms caught me under my shoulders, saving me from the fall. But it didn't matter. My consciousness spun out, collapsing into pitch blackness. I woke up in a sterile hospital room the following morning. My head was throbbing in sync with the heavy, slow beating of my heart. The bright room swam before my eyes. The first thing I was able to focus on was my father's pale, exhausted face. Standing awkwardly behind him was his young wife, her cheeks wet and her eyes swollen and red. I didn't really believe she was crying for me. From them, I learned that I had suffered massive blood loss. If it hadn't been for the delivery driver, Sasha, who immediately administered first aid and tightly bandaged my wound, the paramedics wouldn't have gotten me to the ER in time. I secretly disagreed with them. If it hadn't been for Sasha, I would have died right there in that hallway. Then, my dad filled in the horrific details of what happened next. Vasily Banko, completely consumed by a severe case of alcohol-induced psychosis, had slaughtered 3 people that day. His wife, an elderly neighbor on the first floor who had been sitting on the bench, and that young girl in the courtyard. In total, including myself, 6 people were attacked. Vasily had rampaged through the streets like a rabid dog off its leash, attacking anyone in his line of sight, until a passing police cruiser shot him dead. Hearing all of this made me physically sick. I confessed to my dad that I felt an overwhelming weight of guilt. I should have tried to stop him somehow, to disarm him, or at least spent the entire day calling the police the very first moment I heard Ludmila screaming through the wall, instead of just ignoring it. If I had, maybe those people would still be alive today. My dad and his wife immediately began reassuring me, insisting that none of this was my fault, and that I would have just been another body on the floor if I had tried to confront an armed madman. Deep down, I know they're probably right. At least, that's what I try to tell myself. But amid all this horrific tragedy, there was one single, undeniable silver lining for me. Now, inside apartment 38, there will forever be a total, breathless silence. Our building will finally be at peace.